Imagine waking up one morning, looking out over your quiet pasture, the same land your family has worked for years, and seeing construction crews carving a bike path straight through it. Not around it, not beside it, through it. In today's video, we're breaking down how an HOA approved and built a community bike path across what they assumed was unused open space, only to realize too late that it was active cattle land. From overlooked property lines and rushed committee votes to liability risks, livestock safety and insurance nightmares. This is a story about what happens when HOA planning forgets due diligence. If you think HOAs only argue about paint colors and lawn height, think again. This one involves fences, furious ranchers, confused cyclists, and a very expensive mistake. It started, as these things often do, with a well-intentioned idea presented under fluorescent lights in a neatly arranged clubhouse meeting room. The HOA board had been searching for something bold, something visible, a project that would make residents feel like their dues were building more than just neatly trimmed hedges and freshly painted curbs. Attendance at meetings had been low. Community engagement was fading. A few outspoken homeowners had begun questioning where the money was going. So when the Community Enhancement Committee introduced the concept of a scenic bike path, it sounded perfect. They called it the Greenway Initiative. On paper, it was everything a modern neighborhood could want. A winding, family-friendly cycling and walking path connecting the north and south entrances of the subdivision. It would promote health, sustainability, and community connection. It would increase property values. It would attract younger families. The presentation slides were polished. Stock photos of smiling parents biking alongside children, golden sunsets filtering through trees, neighbors waving at each other in a picture-perfect suburban dream. Applause followed. The HOA president emphasized how forward-thinking the board needed to be. Other neighborhoods nearby had added pickleball courts and dog parks. This would be bigger, more impressive, a signature feature. And then someone pointed to the map. Behind the homes along Cedar Ridge sat a wide stretch of open land. On the subdivision plat, it was labeled simply as adjacent open space. To many board members, it looked unused. Just grass and fencing beyond the property line. No houses, no playgrounds, no visible structures. A straight line across that open stretch would create the most efficient path connection. The treasurer asked whether acquiring access would be difficult. The property manager replied confidently, "It shouldn't be a problem. It's just pasture land." Those words, "just pasture land," quietly set everything in motion. There were questions, but they were surface level. Was the soil stable enough for paving? Yes, according to a preliminary contractor estimate. Would lighting be required? Possibly solar bollards. How much would it cost? A manageable figure, especially if phased. The board voted to move forward with feasibility planning. What wasn't discussed in depth was ownership or usage. The land looked empty from the rear fences of the subdivision. It wasn't landscaped. It wasn't developed. No signage indicated private activity from the neighborhood's vantage point. To suburban eyes accustomed to manicured lawns and designated amenities, it appeared idle, waiting to be improved. In truth, that open space was part of an active cattle pasture that had been operating long before the subdivision ever broke ground. But that fact never surfaced in the initial excitement. Over the next few weeks, the vision grew. Architectural sketches were commissioned. The path would curve slightly to create visual interest. Native plants would line the edges. A small rest area with a bench and community sign could sit near the midpoint. Marketing language for the next HOA newsletter described it as an investment in our future. Residents responded enthusiastically. Emails poured in praising the idea. Parents loved the thought of children riding safely away from main roads. Retirees appreciated the walking option. One homeowner even suggested hosting a ribbon-cutting event with local media. Momentum built quickly, and momentum has a way of drowning out caution. During the second planning meeting, a board member briefly asked whether the land might belong to the rancher whose cattle were occasionally visible beyond the fence line. The property manager reassured them. The path would run along the edge. We'll confirm easements before final approval. That confirmation never became urgent. Instead, the discussion shifted to aesthetics. Should the path be 8 feet wide or 10? Asphalt or compacted gravel? Would homeowners prefer natural fencing or decorative railings? The board voted again, this time to allocate funds for survey and contractor scheduling. Somewhere between enthusiasm and execution, assumptions hardened into decisions. Assumptions hardened into decisions. The survey request was submitted with language describing the area as bordering open pasture. The contractor performed a surface inspection from the subdivision side of the fence, but did not conduct a full operational assessment of livestock activity. After all, they were evaluating a path, not ranch infrastructure. Meanwhile, the cattle grazed as they always had, seasonally rotated across sections of pasture, moved through gates, guided along established routes that the rancher had carefully maintained for years. To the HOA, the land was a blank canvas. To the rancher, it was a working system. But the board never sat down with him. They never knocked on his door, never asked how the land functioned day to day, never discussed fencing integrity, herd movement, or liability risks associated with mixing cyclists and livestock. From their perspective, they were simply enhancing community access along a boundary line. The board president summarized it confidently in one meeting. "We are not taking anything away from anyone. We're just improving what's already there." That statement received nods around the table. Permits were fast-tracked through internal HOA approval channels. The project was framed as a boundary improvement rather than a land acquisition issue. Since the path technically hugged the perceived edge of association land, and because no immediate objections had surfaced, the board felt justified proceeding. There was pride in moving quickly, in being decisive, in delivering results. A groundbreaking date was tentatively set. In newsletters and online forums, the Greenway Initiative became a symbol of progress. Residents debated landscaping ideas. Some even asked about adding exercise stations along the route. The excitement became self-reinforcing. The more people talked about it, the more inevitable it seemed. And inevitable it seemed. And inevitability can be dangerous. Because the one detail that should have anchored the entire conversation, that the pasture was active cattle land, remained buried beneath optimism. From the board's vantage point, they saw grass and fences. From the board's vantage point, they saw grass and fences. They did not see grazing patterns. They saw open space. They did not see private operations. They saw opportunity. They did not see risk. Chapter 1 ends not with conflict. Not yet, but with a vote recorded in meeting minutes. Motion carried unanimously to proceed with Phase 1 construction of the Greenway Path. A bold vision, a confident board, a community applauding forward movement, and a pasture still full of cattle. The mistake wasn't malicious. It wasn't reckless in appearance. It was something quieter, an assumption repeated often enough that it began to feel like fact. The board believed they were building something beautiful. The first sign that something wasn't as simple as it seemed came not from a lawyer or a surveyor or even a board member. It came from a broken fence post. 3 days into preliminary site work, a construction crew removed a stretch of aging wire fencing that ran along what the HOA believed was the edge of its usable boundary. The plan was to replace it later with a more community-friendly barrier, something safer and more visually appealing for cyclists. When the old fencing came down, the pasture opened, and cattle noticed. A few cows drifted closer to the newly exposed line, curious about the unfamiliar equipment and sounds. The heavy machinery had disturbed the soil, flattening grass in a way that suggested a new path, and cattle, by nature, investigate change. By mid-afternoon, one young steer stepped through the gap, then another. Within hours, livestock had crossed into what the HOA considered the buffer zone behind several homes along Cedar Ridge. Residents panicked. Photos began appearing in the community Facebook group. Large brown cattle wandering near backyard swing sets, grazing along decorative shrubs, standing calmly but imposingly near patio furniture. The post started politely, "Does anyone know why there are cows behind our houses?" Then escalated quickly, "This feels unsafe. Who approved this? Are we liable if someone gets hurt?" The board members, caught off guard, contacted the construction supervisor, who explained that the fencing they removed appeared old and temporary. They assumed it marked the edge of usable land, not an active livestock boundary, so that assumption triggered the phone call that should have happened weeks earlier. The rancher, he arrived the next morning in a dust-covered truck, boots still muddy from early feed rounds. He didn't storm into the HOA office. He didn't shout. He walked the land first. He saw tire tracks cutting across grazing sections that had been carefully rotated to preserve grass growth. He saw survey flags marking a straight-line path to an area his cattle relied on for water access during dry months. He saw fencing removed without replacement, and then he saw homeowners staring nervously at animals that had every right to be there. When he finally spoke to the property manager, his tone was controlled, but firm. This isn't unused land. It was the first time those words were spoken clearly in the HOA's presence. The pasture wasn't decorative. It wasn't idle. It wasn't waiting for improvement. It was operational. The rancher explained that the subdivision had been built adjacent to his family's cattle operation decades after he'd acquired the land. The fencing wasn't symbolic, it was functional. It maintained herd boundaries. It guided movement between grazing sectors. It prevented animals from accessing residential zones for everyone's safety. Removing it disrupted more than a border. It disrupted a system. The HOA board scrambled for documentation. They pulled up subdivision plats, easement diagrams, archived meeting minutes from years prior. Somewhere in the development paperwork, references to adjacent agricultural land existed. But over time, familiarity had turned that phrase into background noise. Agricultural land sounded distant. Pasture sounded empty. Cattle sounded occasional. The reality was daily, active livestock management. A professional survey was finally commissioned, this time with urgency. The results were uncomfortable. The proposed bike path route crossed into privately owned ranch property in multiple sections. What the board believed to be HOA buffer space was, in fact, part of the ranch's grazing tract. The visual boundary residents assumed marked association land had never been formally transferred. In other words, the HOA hadn't built along the edge. They had built into it. The construction halt came immediately, but damage had already begun. The rancher detailed the operational risks the board hadn't considered. Cattle are sensitive to unfamiliar movement patterns. Cyclists moving quickly along fence lines can spook animals, leading to stress injuries or fence breaches. Liability becomes complicated when livestock and recreational traffic share proximity. Who would be responsible if a cyclist startled a steer and caused it to bolt through a weak section of fencing? Who would cover veterinary costs if cattle were injured by construction debris? The resident child approached livestock too closely. The HOA's insurance carrier was contacted next with. The response was sobering. If the path existed on land not formally owned or properly easemented by the association, coverage would not apply. If livestock-related incidents occurred due to altered fencing or land modification initiated by the HOA, liability could extend directly to the board. Suddenly, what had been marketed as a feel-good community enhancement carried serious exposure. Residents, once excited about sunset bike rides, now worried about property damage and safety, the board called an emergency meeting. The mood was drastically different from the early Greenway Initiative enthusiasm. No polished slides. No stock images of happy families cycling. Just maps, legal language, and rising tension. One board member admitted what others were thinking. We assumed. They assumed because the land looked open. They assumed because no one had objected early. They assumed because the fence appeared old and unimportant. They assumed because pasture, to suburban eyes, didn't feel active in the same way a storefront or warehouse might. The rancher invited to speak explained how grazing rotation works, how specific sections rest while others are used, how access to water points determines movement patterns, how fencing is adjusted seasonally. What looked random from a backyard view was actually intentional land stewardship. The HOA hadn't just crossed a property line. They had crossed into someone else's livelihood, and the emotional undercurrent began to shift. Some residents sympathized with the rancher. Others felt frustrated that the board hadn't performed deeper due diligence. A few still argued the path was a good idea, just poorly executed, but the overlooked detail could no longer be minimized. This was not vacant land. It was active cattle land, and that phrase, once spoken clearly, changed everything. The construction equipment sat idle for days while lawyers reviewed options. Rebuilding the fence became an immediate priority, but even that required coordination to avoid further disrupting herd patterns. Trust, however, is harder to rebuild than fencing. The rancher made one thing clear. Future discussions would require formal agreements, land use clarity, and compensation if access was ever considered. The HOA board, once confident in its vision, now faced a humbling realization. They hadn't asked the most basic question: whose land is this? Chapter 2 closes with that unanswered question echoing through a divided community, one side seeing opportunity, the other seeing intrusion. The pasture remained green. The cattle continued grazing, but the illusion of unused open space was gone. In its place stood a boundary, not just physical, but legal and personal, that had been there all along. It simply hadn't been acknowledged. By the time the emergency meeting ended and the legal emails began flying back and forth, the most uncomfortable truth had already surfaced. Construction had started without formal consent from the actual landowner. The board had approved Phase 1 based on internal maps and visual assumptions. Contractors had been scheduled, deposits had been paid, equipment had been delivered. From the HOA's perspective, the process had followed procedure. From the rancher's perspective, strangers had entered his operational land and altered it. That difference in viewpoint created immediate tension. The construction company, caught in the middle, insisted they were acting under the HOA's direction. Their contract specified the bike path route as provided by the association's planning documents. They had no reason to question property lines beyond what they were shown. But intent didn't erase impact. Sections of soil had already been graded. Survey stakes marked a clear, straight line cutting across grazing territory. Temporary barriers had replaced functional livestock fencing. Tire ruts carved through grass that had been carefully rotated for seasonal feeding. Each visible change made the situation harder to frame as a misunderstanding. When the rancher formally demanded a halt to all activity on his property, he did so through legal counsel. The tone shifted from neighborly frustration to documented objection. A cease and desist letter arrived at the HOA management office within 48 hours. That letter changed everything. Suddenly, what had been an internal planning oversight became potential trespass. The board's legal advisor warned that continuing work, even to correct the issue, without a negotiated agreement could expose the association to significant liability. Any further disturbance could strengthen claims of property damage. Work stopped completely. Equipment sat idle along the half-cleared strip of land, visible from both the subdivision and the pasture. It became a physical symbol of overreach, a reminder that the project had moved faster than the facts. Residents walking along their backyard fences could see the unfinished pathbed. Cyclists who had anticipated a smooth greenway now saw churned dirt and silence. Rumors spread quickly. Did we really not own that land? Are we being sued? Who approved this? At the next board meeting, attendance tripled. Homeowners demanded transparency. Some accused the board of negligence. Others defended the original vision but questioned the execution. Emotions ran high, not just because of the legal risk, but because trust had been shaken. The board president acknowledged the mistake publicly. The land use verification had not been completed before authorizing construction. That admission didn't undo the damage. Meanwhile, the rancher worked to restore temporary fencing and reestablish herd boundaries. Cattle had to be redirected. Grazing schedules adjusted. The disruption was manageable but unnecessary, and that was the core issue. This wasn't a battle over progress versus tradition. It was about consent. Construction had begun on land that wasn't theirs, not intentionally, but undeniably. What the HOA viewed as improvement, the rancher experienced as intrusion. Chapter 3 ends with the project suspended, the path unfinished, and both sides standing firmly on opposite sides of a fence that now represented more than just livestock control. It represented a line that should have been respected from the start. Chapter 4: Cattle, Cyclists, and Liability. If the broken fence exposed the oversight, liability exposed the risk. Once the cease and desist letter halted construction, the conversation shifted from property lines to consequences. What would have happened if the path had opened as planned? What if cyclists had already begun using it? What if livestock and recreational traffic had intersected in ways no one anticipated? The HOA's insurance carrier requested documentation: surveys, easements, contracts, incident logs, fencing diagrams. The questions were pointed and clinical. Was there a formal shared use agreement with the rancher? No. Was the path entirely within HOA-owned property? No. Had livestock risk been assessed? No. The tone of the follow-up email was polite but firm. Coverage would be limited if the association knowingly operated improvements on land it did not legally control. Furthermore, introducing public foot and bike traffic adjacent to active cattle operations significantly altered risk exposure. That phrase, altered risk exposure, echoed through the next board meeting. Until that moment, many residents had framed the issue as a paperwork mistake, a boundary clarification, something fixable with revised maps and better communication. But the liability conversation reframed everything. Cattle are not decorative farm animals grazing peacefully for aesthetic charm. They are large, powerful livestock weighing over 1,000 pounds. They react to noise, sudden motion, unfamiliar movement patterns. Cyclists, especially children, move quickly and unpredictably. Helmets flash in sunlight. Gears click. Tires hum. Dogs sometimes run alongside bikes. In isolation, both cattle and cyclists are manageable. Together, without structured separation, they create uncertainty. The rancher, now attending meetings with council present, explained calmly what seasoned agricultural operators already understand. Even well-tempered cattle can spook. A startled steer can bolt through fencing. A mother protecting a calf can behave defensively. If an animal breaks through a weakened barrier into residential space, damage extends beyond landscaping. It becomes a public safety issue. Conversely, if a cyclist were injured by contact with livestock, directly or indirectly, questions would immediately arise. Prevented the proximity, who ensured fencing integrity, of who assessed behavioral risk. If the path remained partially on ranch land without agreement, the rancher could argue unauthorized interference created unsafe conditions. If it shifted entirely onto HOA land but remained adjacent to livestock fencing, the HOA could still face claims for creating foreseeable hazards. Insurance adjusters think in hypotheticals, lawyers think in precedents, and suddenly, the Greenway Initiative looked less like a lifestyle enhancement and more like a layered exposure scenario. One board member asked a difficult question: what if a child feeds the cattle? It sounded simple, almost harmless, but agricultural liability law doesn't operate on harmless assumptions. If residents treated livestock as petting zoo animals, approaching fences, reaching through rails, tossing food, injuries could occur on either side. Cattle could be harmed by inappropriate feeding. Residents could be injured by sudden movement or crushing against fencing. Would warning signs be enough? Would additional fencing solve it? Would double barriers be required? Each solution added cost. Each layer acknowledged risk that had never been considered at the outset. Then came the financial modeling. The treasurer presented a revised projection: legal consultation fees, emergency survey costs, temporary fencing replacement, potential settlement reserves, and the possibility of redesigning the path entirely within HOA boundaries, if that were even feasible. The original budget had been presented as a manageable capital improvement. Now, contingency numbers doubled it, possibly tripled it. Some argued the project should be abandoned completely, cut losses, repair the fence, apologize, and move on. Others insisted the vision was still worthwhile, but only with proper land acquisition or easement agreements negotiated fairly with the rancher. A smaller group quietly worried about something deeper: trust and governance. Because liability isn't only financial, it's reputational. The HOA had presented itself as careful, organized, forward-thinking. Yet this situation suggested haste, assumption, overconfidence in informal interpretations of land boundaries. During one particularly tense meeting, the rancher spoke again, this time not about cattle behavior, but about precedent. If this path had opened, he said, and something happened, the first question everyone would ask is, who allowed this? Silence followed, because everyone knew the answer. The board had, and while their intentions had been community-focused, intention doesn't neutralize responsibility. Insurance carriers assess risk based on foreseeability. Could a reasonable board have anticipated livestock interaction risks? Yes. Could they have confirmed property lines before construction? Yes. Could they have consulted the neighboring landowner? Yes. Those yes answers tightened the room. The property manager proposed commissioning a full risk assessment study if the project were to continue. The cost was significant, but so was potential exposure. Professional agricultural consultants would evaluate fencing requirements, buffer zones, animal behavior mitigation strategies, and shared use liability agreements. The rancher indicated he would consider negotiation, but only if his operational needs were fully respected and compensated. That introduced a new reality. The HOA might need to purchase a formal easement, which meant acknowledging contractually that the land was never theirs to begin with. The psychological shift was substantial. What had begun as a confident board-led enhancement now required humility, negotiation, and legal precision. Residents who once envisioned leisurely bike rides now pictured worst-case scenarios: ambulances, lawsuits, news coverage framing the neighborhood as reckless. Even those who still supported the concept agreed on one point: the path could not proceed as originally planned. Cattle and cyclists could coexist in theory, but coexistence demands structure, consent, and risk mitigation, not assumption. Chapter 4 closes with a community forced to confront the real cost of oversight, not just in dollars, but in exposure. The unfinished dirt strip still cuts across the pasture. The cattle still graze, and the HOA now understands that building amenities is easier than building accountability. Because once liability enters the conversation, Every decision carries weight. Hash, hash, hash. Chapter 5. The Costly Fallout. By the time the dust settled, literally and figuratively, the Greenway Initiative was no longer a symbol of progress. It was a line item, a very expensive one. The unfinished stretch of graded earth sat like a scar between the subdivision and the pasture. Temporary fencing had been reinforced. Survey markers had been removed. Construction equipment was gone, but the financial and political impact remained. The HOA's attorney presented the first comprehensive damage estimate during a closed executive session. Legal consultation fees, emergency land survey costs, contractor cancellation penalties, fence reconstruction reimbursement to the rancher, soil restoration where grading had disrupted grazing patterns. The total already exceeded the original projected cost of the entire bike path, and that was before discussing potential settlement terms. The rancher had not filed a lawsuit, but he had made it clear that trespass and operational disruption carried consequences. His counsel submitted documentation outlining livestock stress impacts, altered grazing rotation, and labor costs required to reestablish herd flow. None of it was exaggerated. It was simply calculated wetland. It was simply calculated compensation, quietly, or prepare for a public legal battle that could drag on for months, possibly years. The practical answer was negotiation. The emotional answer for some board members was defensiveness. We were trying to improve the community. That land looked unused. There was no malicious intent. All true, and none of it erased the reality that construction had occurred without verified rights. The settlement discussions were tense but professional. Ultimately, the HOA agreed to cover documented restoration costs, replace fencing to agricultural standard specifications, not decorative community style, and fund an independent assessment confirming no long-term damage to pasture viability. In exchange, the rancher agreed not to pursue additional claims. The agreement included one more critical clause. Any future land use proposal would require written negotiation before public announcement or board vote. It was a quiet acknowledgement of what should have happened from the beginning. But the financial settlement was only part of the fallout. The political consequences inside the community proved just as disruptive. Residents began asking harder questions about governance oversight. How had due diligence failed at such a basic level? Why weren't property lines confirmed before contractor deposits were paid? Why had enthusiasm replaced verification? At the next annual election, 2 board seats were up for renewal. Both incumbents chose not to run. In their place, candidates campaigned on transparency, risk management, and financial accountability. Campaign flyers referenced the Pasture project without naming it directly. Town hall discussions centered on governance reform. The Greenway Initiative had reshaped the HOA's internal culture. Trust, once assumed, now had to be rebuilt. Meanwhile, property values, the very thing the path was meant to enhance, faced short-term uncertainty. Word spread beyond the subdivision. Nearby communities heard about the halted project. Some prospective buyers asked direct questions about legal disputes. Nothing catastrophic happened, but perception shifted. The board commissioned an independent audit of project approval procedures. New policies were drafted requiring formal land ownership verification before capital improvement votes, mandatory adjacent landowner consultation for boundary projects, legal review prior to contractor mobilization, risk exposure assessments for projects involving shared use proximity. These policies came at a cost, administrative and financial, but they became part of the HOA's operating framework moving forward. And then there was the human side. The rancher and the neighborhood had always coexisted quietly. Residents waved occasionally. Children pointed at grazing cattle with curiosity. There was an unspoken understanding of rural meet suburban boundaries. That relationship had been strained, not broken, but altered, polite but measured. Over time, something unexpected happened. Dialogue improved. A small committee of residents requested a meeting with the rancher, not about the bike path, but about understanding the land they lived beside. He agreed. They walked sections of the pasture together. He explained rotational grazing, fence maintenance, seasonal calving patterns. What had once been labeled open space began to be understood as a working ecosystem. The bike path itself was never completed along that route. Instead, after a year of revised planning, the HOA redirected funds toward improving internal sidewalks fully within its property lines. It wasn't as dramatic as the original vision. It didn't cut across scenic pasture views, but it was safe, lawful, controlled. The experience left a lasting lesson embedded in board culture. With progress without permission is exposure. Ambition without verification is risk. And the final community newsletter addressing the issue, the new board president wrote carefully crafted language. While the Greenway project began with positive intentions, we acknowledge that proper due diligence was not fully completed prior to initiating construction. We have implemented stronger safeguards to ensure all future improvements align with property rights, safety standards, and responsible governance. It was as close to an apology as a formal HOA document typically allows. Financially, the association absorbed the loss through reserve funds. Dues did not spike dramatically, but planned upgrades elsewhere were postponed for 2 fiscal years to rebuild reserves. Residents noticed landscaping refreshes were delayed. A clubhouse renovation was pushed back. The ripple effect touched areas far removed from the pasture. That is the hidden cost of oversight. Not just the immediate expense, but the opportunity cost of what could have been done instead. As for the rancher, operations returned to normal. The restored fencing held, grazing patterns stabilized. Life moved forward, but one difference remained. Where the unfinished path had once been graded, the soil now showed a faint variation in growth. A reminder of disturbance. Grass grows back, but the land remembers, and so did the community. The bike path was supposed to connect neighbors. With instead it exposed boundaries. It revealed how quickly assumption can replace confirmation, how easily unused can be mistaken for unowned, how governance requires more than vision. It requires verification. Chapter 5 ends not with a ribbon-cutting ceremony, but with a quieter outcome, a community more cautious, a rancher more vigilant, and a pasture that, despite everything, continued doing exactly what it had always done, supporting cattle season after season, long before anyone imagined paving a path through it.